I want to read a bit from the Drag Story Hour website, specifically Drag Pedagogy. This article, written collaboratively by an education scholar and a drag queen involved in organizing DSH, contextualizes the program within the landscape of gender in education as well as within the world of drag, and argues that Drag Story Hour provides a generative extension of queer pedagogy into the world of early childhood education. Drawing on the work of Jose Esteban Munoz, the authors discuss 5 interrelated elements of DSH that offer early childhood educators a way into a sense of queer imagination: play as praxis, aesthetic transformation, strategic defiance, destigmatization of shame, and embodied kinship. Ultimately, the authors propose that drag pedagogy provides a performative approach to queer pedagogy that is not simply about LGBT lives, but living queerly. The article in question is 22 pages long, so that'll be part 2. Drag Pedagogy, the playful practice of queer imagination in early childhood. Drag queens have historically been relegated to the realm of the night. In the past few years, however, drag performers have made their way from the dimly lit neighborhoods and into the fluorescent lights of libraries and classrooms. Drag superstar Nina West released a children's music album entitled Drag is Magic in 2019, and multiple children's books about drag were published in 2020. These efforts build upon the foundational work of many lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth organizations like San Francisco's Queens of the Castro, which has explored drag with high school students for the last decade. In this article, we explore the pedagogical contributions of a program called Drag Queen Story Hour as a form of queer imagining in an early childhood context. Through this program, drag artists have channeled their penchant for playfully reading each other into filth, into different forms of literacy, promoting storytelling as integral to queer and trans communities, as well as positioning queer and trans cultural forms as valuable components of early childhood education. We are guided by the following question: what might Drag Queen Story Hour offer educators as a way of bringing queer ways of knowing and being into the education of young children? The emergence of DQSH coincides with a heightened visibility of LGBT people in general and drag performance in particular, intensifying critical questions about the commodification of queer cultures around the world. For example, the commercial success of the television show RuPaul's Drag Race has raised the international profile of drag, drawing what seems to be an increasingly mainstream audience. Still, visibly queer space is increasingly hard to find, and queer and trans communities face dangerous realities. Gay bars all over the United States are closing their doors as historically queer neighborhoods gentrify and community building increasingly moves online. Despite the dominant portrayal of issues like marriage and military inclusion as the principal goals of the LGBT civil rights movement, queer and trans activists are working to draw public attention to queer poverty, violence against queer trans people of color, and anti-LGBT government politics. Within this complex political landscape, DQSH seems to uniquely thread the needle between queer activism and broad cultural acceptance. That is, DQSH creates spaces for young children and families to immerse themselves in LGBT-themed stories, and does so in ways that seem to genuinely reflect queer ways of being and relating, rather than as a neatly marketed product. We believe that this makes DQSH worthy of closer study. We argue that the program creates a pathway into the imaginative, messy, and rule-breaking aspects of drag for children without necessarily watering down queer cultures. I would like to remind you, this is from their own website. So, in case anyone thinks I'm being extreme or cherry picking, no, this is what it is. Drag Queen Story Hour, a Herstory. It's like history, but it's hers. DQSH grew from queer author Michelle T's personal desire to connect her toddler with queer culture. As the outgoing executive director of the San Francisco literary nonprofit Radar Productions, T conceived of the program in 2015, which was launched under the leadership of incoming executive director Julie Delgado Lopra and managing director Virgie Tovar. Soon after, DQSH was replicated in established organizations and in DIY style events around the world. Most have taken place in libraries, schools, public stores, and other community spaces. Readings have happened in dozens of locales from major cities like New York, Mexico City, and Tokyo to smaller ones like Cleveland, Tennessee, and San Marcos, Texas. Many coordinate under an incorporated nonprofit organization, though others operate independently. Like most drag performance, there's no consistent formula for DQSH, yet there are similarities across events. Most feature 1 to 3 drag performers. The overwhelming majority are drag queens, but there are occasional kings or other gender-bending performers. DQSH performers read a handful of children's books and lead children in movement and craft-based activities like making wands or tiaras. Book selections often include queer and or trans characters, gender transgressive themes, or narratives about not fitting in and finding one's voice. Some translate drag's penchant for taboo to kids' ideas of silly topics like making a mess or potty time. Occasionally, a queen performs a lip sync of songs from a children's film. At many events, organizers invite kids to create their own drag name or study feminist icons using DQSH's self-published Dragtivity book. Few cities have expanded programming to include bilingual readers, events geared specifically towards neurodivergent children and others with disabilities, or programs for teenagers that feature makeup and performance workshops. DQSH events have received widespread media coverage and been sponsored by a variety of institutions, but the program has not been without controversy. Few city councils have condemned the use of public space for story hours. Librarians and queens have received death threats. Drag performers associated with DQSH have been mocked and condemned in popular conservative media. Several story hours have been canceled due to credible threats of violence. In a few cases, armed protesters have shown up to libraries. Many of these protests have been investigated by a small group of far-right conservative organizations and media personalities eager to position DQSH as the new face of long-standing culture wars, echoing tired homo and transphobic talking points. This backlash gestures towards the fraught nature of connecting kids to overtly queer content, particularly in politically conservative regions. Still, DQSH receives overwhelmingly positive feedback and struggles to keep up with the demand for its programs. Again, this is their article that they have linked on their own website. I am taking none of it out of context. Conceptualizing Drag Pedagogy. We take the public interest in DQSH as a starting point to highlight the generative pedagogical work that drag may offer to children. Many elements of DQSH are common to early childhood schooling: bright colors, music, art, and imaginative play. There is an adult teacher leading a classroom of young children. What is different, though, is that the teacher is a drag queen. She breaks the limiting stereotype of a teacher. She is loud, extravagant, and playful. She encourages children to think for themselves and even to break the rules. She is the exponential product of Miss Frizzle and Bob the Drag Queen. She is a queer teacher to the unimaginative adult, which, describes most of us. It might seem that the world of drag and the world of children are impossibly distinct from one another. Yet, their meeting has left many audiences wondering why they hadn't considered it before. DQSH co-founder Julie Delgado Lopra notes this overlooked affinity in an interview. Quote, "I think generally queens are not mixed with kids, especially drag queens. It's a kid's world to be very imaginative," end quote. Co-founder Michelle T also commented, "They're both very funny and see the humor in the world. And for drag queens, the idea is about pushing limits and pushing boundaries." Such generalizations may not always apply, but these comments lead us to ask, what if we took play, defiance, and imagination seriously as forms of knowledge production? If we celebrated the convergence of children and drag queens, what kind of potentialities might their collaboration hold? We write this article from the standpoint of an education scholar and former elementary educator Harper, Keenan, and a doctoral student in media studies who is a DQSH queen and organizer, Lil Miss Hot Mess. Given these positions, we make no effort to hide our bias. We're both supporters of this program, and Lil Miss Hot Mess is involved in its leadership. Our purpose, then, is to make use of our unique positions as scholar practitioners to highlight the pedagogical elements of DQSH that may not be immediately obvious to its audiences. Combined with our experiential knowledge of working with children and living in queer trans communities where drag is often a celebrated tradition, we incorporate theories drawn from the academic fields of education, performance, and queer and trans studies to consider how drag queens and children might work together. However, fleetingly, to promote a spirit of creative inquiry and world-making. We propose that DQSH offers a particular kind of queer framework, what we call drag pedagogy, or teaching and learning that extends beyond traditional approaches to LGBT curricular inclusion. Themes within drag pedagogy, applicable beyond the context of drag itself, move away from the vocabulary lessons and the token inclusion of LGBT heroes to begin to engage deeper understandings of queer cultures and envision new modes of being together. We insist that drag pedagogy resists didactic instruction and is not prescriptive. Instead, it artfully invites children to building communities that are more hospitable to queer knowledge and experience. Before we sashay into the world of drag queens and children, let's get a few things clear, or queer. Firstly, drag is sometimes erroneously conflated with trans. As a genderqueer drag performer scholar and a trans scholar, we are acutely aware and tired of this problem. It happens in both conservative and liberal discourses. This conflation has led to occasional tensions even within the queer and trans communities. Thus, we wish to be explicit. These terms are not synonymous. However, drag and trans overlap given that some drag artists are trans. While drag generally refers to a kind of consciously artistic performance intended for an audience, in contrast, trans people do not seek primarily to entertain. Yet, there is historical slippage between these two categories, especially as language has evolved over the past century. Many of the leaders most celebrated within the early trans movement described themselves as drag queens and/or as street queens or transvestites, including Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. One cannot meaningfully address trans history and struggle without engaging the history of drag. However, a full examination of those historical relationships is beyond the scope of this article. For our purposes, suffice it to say that the practice of drag and otherwise refashioning gender long predate the current terminology used to describe human experience. We expect that readers can make sense of this complicated terrain. After all, as might be said at a drag show, this is not amateur night. So, bring your notes and put on those glasses, everybody, because this requires reading on multiple levels. In what follows, we begin by addressing legacies of schooling and its role in teaching children about gender norms and other aspects of personhood. We offer a brief background on drag, analyzing it not only in terms of its gender disruptions, but also its own vernacular pedagogies and community engagement. In the second half of this article, we describe the kinds of knowledge that drag pedagogy can share with children of all ages. We focus on 5 interrelated themes: play as praxis, aesthetic transformation, strategic defiance, camp and its relationship to stigma, and embodied kinship. Ultimately, we suggest that drag pedagogy offers one model for learning not simply about queer lives, but how to live queerly. And we're living for it. And again, this is from their own website. Schooling children scripted childhood. The institution of public school was founded in part as a way of maintaining nation states. Thus, the professional vision of educators is often shaped to reproduce the state's normative vision of its ideal citizenry. In effect, schooling functions as a way to straighten the child into a kind of captive alignment with the current perimeters of that vision. Put differently, the design of schooling often serves as a kind of trellis that trains children away from social divergence in order to grow up to become adults who are viewed as socially and economically productive. In contrast, Catherine Bond Stockton suggests a metaphor of queer sideways growth that is possible for all children, regardless of gender or sexuality. This framework, which counters dominant thinking about child development, is not directed toward a predetermined endpoint of growing up, but rather functions as an irregularized broadening of children's own interests, abilities, and eccentricities on their own terms. Here, it is important to differentiate between queer as an identity that individuals claim for themselves and queer as an analytic. Many people, including both authors, use the word queer to describe ourselves. Although queerness refuses crystallized meaning, one use of the term in this article generally refers to our desire to practice an embodied political resistance to confining constructs of gender and sexuality as they are produced by the institutions and social relations that govern our lives. As an analytic frame, however, queer is not limited to the individual person. Queer theory can be used to examine how often impossible standards of normalcy are formed, not only through institutional categorization of gender and sexuality, but also through social expectations produced through the racialized structures of capitalism that are inextricably intertwined with their hierarchy. Building in part from queer theory and trans studies, queer and trans pedagogies seek to actively destabilize the normative function of schooling through transformative education. This is a fundamentally different orientation than movements towards the inclusion or assimilation of LGBT people into the existing structures of school and society. As a practical example, in the early childhood classroom, consider the common practice of sorting children into groups of boys and girls. An inclusion stance might allow children to decide for themselves whether they would like to be in a boys' or a girls' group, whereas a transformative approach might work with children to inquire as to how boyness and girlness are given meaning, the limits of these two categories, and how people might organize themselves differently. Throughout history and into the present, tremendous effort has been devoted to managing how children understand and embody gender. From their inception, institutions within the modern nation-state, the medical clinic, the courthouse, the asylum, the prison, and the school among them, have established and policed the borders of gender. Here, we emphasize that within the realities of our lives, gender never exists in isolation. Instead, the sets of lines drawn across living minds and bodies intersects with the countless lines drawn across the living world by centuries of global imperialism and colonialism enabled by ideologies of white supremacy. To state it plainly, within the historical context of the USA and Western Europe, the institutional management of gender has been used as a way of maintaining racist and capitalist modes of reproduction. Trans studies scholar Jules Gill Peterson argued that within this context, childhood is positioned as a form of futures trading, wherein categories of human sorting, e.g., race, class, gender, sexuality, play the role of economic coefficients that produce material consequences for the trajectory of children's lives. Although individuals' experiences are profoundly complex, schooling often categorizes people in ways that train each of our ways of being into compliance with an inflexible script. That script, which is enforced through formal institutions as well as through social interactions, operates on multiple levels. The script of gender teaches the public not only what gender is in some essential sense, setting up a binary between womanhood and manhood, but that some gendered ways of being are acceptable and others are not. In the USA, for example, most people learn that the most valuable boy will be white, engage in rough and tumble play with other boys that will toughen him up and straighten him out, allowing him to mature into a man who wears a suit and tie, makes a lot of money, enters into a sexually monogamous marriage with a woman, buys a house, and has enough but not too many children. In other words, a script that may begin with gender shapes how individuals are taught to understand their expected roles in society in ways that extend far beyond gender alone. Almost no one can fully conform to the script of gender all the time. Despite their efforts, public institutions and other producers of gendered borders cannot comprehensively account for the complexities of human existence. Yet, it is also virtually impossible to completely go off script. Trans and gender non-conforming people, particularly those who are multiply marginalized, are with disturbing frequency violently scapegoated for breaking gender's rules and revealing the limits of those rules. However, the failures of a nominative system of gender extend far beyond only those who self-identify as queer, trans, or otherwise beyond the narrow comprehension of the law. Harmful impacts of institutionalized gender normativity reverberate across the living world. Generations of feminist, queer, and trans scholarship within and across the fields of Black and Indigenous studies, queer, trans, of color, critique, and disability studies illustrate how gender normativity works to maintain the larger structures that facilitate its production. Coloniality and racial capitalism central among them. Schooling plays a central role in shaping how the public learns the behaviors considered necessary for survival. At the same time as each of us learn gendered scripts, we also learn about the consequences of diverting from them. What happens when you don't learn the lines of your assigned script? What if you decide to improv? What if it's just not possible for you to adhere to a script you didn't write? Simply put, you're punished. Within and beyond schools, gender transgression is policed early in life, taking a range of forms that include social ostracism, psychomedical pathologization, the denial of access to life-preserving resources, physical violence, or even death. The stakes are high and they are often unpredictable. The spectacle of these kinds of punishment, in turn, incentivizes conformity with a nominative gender script. A closer look at knowledge production within queer and trans communities is necessary for considering educational tactics that might open possibilities towards a less violent society. Many efforts aimed at LGBT inclusion have replaced one monolithic script of gender with another, rather than engaging with how queer and trans knowledge production may invite us to re-examine the very foundations of how we teach. In their refusal to comply with the dominant paradigm, queer and trans communities reach toward a different kind of world. Jose Esteban Munoz argued in his 2009 book Cruising Utopia that queerness is imagination itself, a yearning for a future not fully conceivable in the present. Queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an identity. Put another way, we are not yet queer. We may never touch queerness, but we can feel it as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us as an identity that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine a future. The future is queerness's domain. Queerness is a structuring and educated mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present. The here and now is a prison house. We turn now to an exploration of drag as pedagogical form embodying the kind of queer imaginative ideality Munoz described. What Munoz described is a Gnostic cult that worships the future. Gender is a prison created by the state to create itself, and queerness is heaven. And God bless, we're only 5 pages in out of 22. And again, this is their own paper, linked in their own website, dragstoryour.org. Drag Pedagogy and Cultural Production. An understanding of the pedagogical work of drag requires engaging with the social meaning of this art form and the kinds of educational and cultural work that it does. We understand drag not merely as gender reversal, but through the expansive description provided by both gay liberation activist Ted Matthews and contemporary drag superstar RuPaul. We are all born naked, and the rest is drag. This simple but profound statement suggests that no performance of gender or other cultural signifier is ever natural, whether on stage or in everyday life, and that drag serves as an international way of rewriting these scripts. Indeed, in queer slang, drag has long been used to describe any form of sartorial stylized performance, from putting on Sunday church drag to, in our cases, librarian and teacher drag. Gender fluidity is a key component of drag. Rather than thinking in binary terms, however, we position drag as a highly stylized series of twists and turns, ranging from the satirical to the sincere. Drag differs from other forms of gender performance in its tendency to mock authority and challenge the status quo, poking fun at stereotypes rather than affirming them. Of course, while drag may be implicitly transgressive, it is not inherently anti-oppressive. Like any art form, drag's possibilities are limited by the views and actions of its practitioners. It is important to note that drag pedagogy predates DQSH. Drag has always included its own practices of teaching and learning. Drag's pedagogical and cultural work extends beyond entertainment to offer artistic interpretations of cultural texts as well as opportunities for building and sustaining community. Performances generally address queer and trans people directly through techniques like invoking community slang or making parodies out of pop songs. Drag often catalyzes what Munoz described as disidentification, a mode of negotiating dominant culture that simultaneously works on, with, and against a cultural form, as a way for minoritized subjects to seize social agency in the public sphere. Building from Munoz, E. Patrick Johnson wrote, "These disidentificatory performances serve material ends, and they do this work by accounting for the context in which these performances occur. The slang, for instance, is not confined solely to the theater, the dance club, or the concert hall. Streets, social service lines, picket lines, loan offices, and emergency rooms, among others, may also serve as useful staging grounds." Indeed, drag performers have made important contributions to social and political change. A quick scroll through drag Herstory reveals numerous examples: leadership in political uprisings like those at Compton's cafeteria and the Stonewall Inn that shaped early gay liberation movements. Performers like Jose Zarya and Joan Jett Black running for political office, and groups like the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence raising funds for HIV/AIDS services and LGBT organizations. Each of these is a pedagogical act in queer own right. In addition to teaching the public, drag performers have well-established ways of learning from each other and their audiences. Many performers study their craft in an adoptive drag family, wherein drag mothers or fathers, sisters, aunties guide their children in anything from how to glue down one's eyebrows to delivering a flawless lip sync. Through interaction with audiences and observing fellow performers, drag artists learn about what fans appreciate and hecklers cling to. Slang like reading and shade denote various forms of sassy but generally supportive critique and play a pedagogical role among tight circles and clubs. Increasingly, many artists learn from social media tutorials or television shows. Though there are common standards or trends within the art of drag, there are few tightly held maxims or scripts. The Insane Theater Kids put together a philosophical work. This is the resource they provide in their own website, dragsstoryhour.org. Reading the children or reading to the children, drag in the classroom. We now turn to 5 overlapping examples of the kinds of cultural knowledge that drag can teach children and educators. We recognize that culture is an imprecise term, yet find some value in the cognitive struggle conjured by its ambiguity, similar to the word queer. This list is also hardly exhaustive. We seek to move beyond assumptions that the purpose of a program like DQSH should be only to expose children to diverse stories or easily digestible morsels of LGBT history and culture. Though DQSH publicly positions its impact in helping children develop empathy, learn about gender diversity and difference, and tap into their own creativity, we argue that its contributions can run deeper than morals and role models. In what follows, we keep with a common drag performance trope in redirecting our readers away from what's said on the surface and towards the subtle nods and zingers that gesture at what is happening between the lines. For us, drag pedagogy is less about imitating drag queens' specific behaviors and more about embodied inquiry into queer and trans ways of being that reach beyond the present. They spell it out for you, exactly what they mean and exactly what they don't mean. You are being used. You, anyone of the LGBT community, anyone who sympathizes with them, anyone who sympathizes with drag performances, any of that, you are being used. They spell it out for you. You can say and cry all you want, oh, it's just this. They say outright, it is not. This is the academic paper they provide as their resource on dragsstoryhour.org. Feeling your fantasy. Play as queer praxis. Though hardly uncontroversial in either domain, play remains a critical component of both drag and early childhood development. Like other forms of make-believe, drag functions as a uniquely queer form of embodied and unscripted play that invites creative world-building. In this way, drag aligns with many early theories of play. Johann Huizinga described play as a free activity standing quite consciously outside ordinary life as being not serious, but at the same time absorbing the player intensely and utterly. What is drag if not dressing up in special costumes and acting out of fantasy outside of everyday life? Play is also framed as inherently unproductive, or as Roger Kaiwa stated, an occasion of pure waste. We suggest that drag's larger value lies largely outside of formal economics. Instead, our understanding of play is rooted in a spirit of amusement without a productive outcome. While drag has some conventions, it ultimately has no rules. Its defining quality is often to break as many rules as possible. Thus, drag can be thought of as a kind of queer praxis that may be especially well suited to early childhood education, not because of any qualities essential to young children, and instead because early education is one of the few remaining school settings that encourages play. Drag similarly breaks boundaries between reality and fantasy in allowing performers to take on new identities and social relationships in material form just by playing the part. Huizinga referred to the etymology of imagination as making an image of something different, something more beautiful or more sublime. The concept of realness, vernacular popularized in Black and Latinx queer trans ballroom communities, articulates a similar sense of becoming through performance. Ballroom performers don outfits to compete in categories like femme queen, schoolboy, or executive realness. As noted in the documentary Paris is Burning, whatever you want to be, you be. You have a chance to display your elegance, your seductiveness, your beauty, your wit, your charm, your knowledge. You can become anything and do anything right here, right now, and it won't be questioned. Drag reminds us that our imaginations need not be limited by embodiment, but that we can all make over our own image to shape how others see us. As it moves into early childhood education settings, the art of drag risks falling into the trap of what Ruben Gasnabid Fernandez calls the rhetoric of effect. The incorporation of play and art in the classroom is regularly justified by this category of instrumentalist claims, including their potential to bolster academic skill development through measurable outcomes. In effect, this framework can turn play into a technology of governmentality in early childhood. As an organization, DQSH may be incentivized to recite lines about alignment with curricular standards and social-emotional learning in order to be legible within public education and philanthropic institutions. Drag itself ultimately does not take these utilitarian aims too seriously, but it is quite good at looking the part when necessary. Instead, drag is firmly rooted in play as a site of queer pleasure, resistance, and self-fashioning. It aims towards play without predetermined purpose. They say it outright, right there. The organization DQSH is lying to you. They're reciting lines to trick you into thinking that it's okay and acceptable for children and early childhood education. These people are using you. These people are using the LGBT communities. This is from the resources of their own website, dragstoryour.org. Serving looks, teaching through aesthetic transformation. DQSH is pedagogical without being particularly pedantic. There are few neat and tidy lessons, no repetitively stated objectives, no scripted curriculum aside from the text of the books read aloud. Instead, the program is based largely on an improvised performance and the appeal of aesthetics. Building from Munoz, we suggest that the aesthetic dimension of drag pedagogy engages with potentiality, that which does not exist in present material form, but on the horizon, rather than possibility, that which already exists in a tangible and real way. While there is a loose and practically oriented common architecture to a story hour, read a book, sing a song, rinse and repeat, the queens do very little to teach anything explicitly. There is no lesson on the meaning of gender, no worksheets on how to be kind, all that is blasé. Such activities would betray integrity to form. Instead, the queens employ a more dialogic approach to a pedagogy that is largely built on a captivating aesthetic that seeks to broaden the imagination. The educational philosopher Maxine Greene, deeply concerned with wide awakeness of awareness of what it is to be in the world, wrote, "To tap into imagination is to become able to break it with what is supposedly fixed and finished, objectively and independently real. It is to see beyond what the imaginer has called normal or common sensible and to carve out new orders in experience. Doing so, a person may become freed to glimpse what might be, to form notions of what should be and what is not yet. And the same person may, at the same time, remain in touch with what presumably is." Or, as drag queen Nina West sang in her children's album, "Drag is a vacation from a boring day. Use your own imagination. All you gotta do is close your eyes and see who you want to be." In the world of drag, you can wear a crown and glitter and bright yellow crinoline and makeup and neon green fishnets and a wig. Everything is dialed up, made more interesting in large part because it is extraordinary. The same book read by a regular teacher seems banal. When a drag queen reads a story, the Technicolor has been turned on and the show has begun. Though there are many layers to drag, its most immediate process of denaturalizing gender and culture happens on the surface through the potentiality held in aesthetics. As early childhood educational philosophies like Reggio Emilia have espoused for generations, visual aesthetics can act as a third teacher in a classroom, playing an equal role in the adults and children in the learning process. In the Reggio Emilia traditions, materials often provide creative provocations to inspire inquiry and learning. It is worth noting here that the Reggio Emilia philosophy developed in connection with the Italian anti-fascist movement in the mid-20th century, demanding a particular political urgency for the cultivation of imagination in children. Within the context of DQSH, the visual style of the queen serves as a provocation that invites inquiry into nominative fashion and embodiment. Glitter, sequins, wigs, and heels all serve as pedagogical tools, inviting questions like, why and how is drag made unusual in this environment? In other words, while verbal communication is a crucial element of DQSH, even if the queen said nothing, we argue that her mere aesthetic presence would be generative, while simultaneously destabilizing many of the mundane assumptions of gendered embodiment and of classroom life through the style, movement, and gesture. DQSH presents a queer relationship to educational experience. The traditional role of the teacher, transformed into a loud and sparkling queen, becomes delightfully excessive. She's less interested in focus, discipline, achievement, or objectives than playful self-expression. Her pedagogy is rooted in pleasure and creativity born, in part, from letting go of control. Can you see how this is bad? could you possibly consider that this is detrimental? They just say it outright in their own resource that they provide in their own website, dragstoryhour.org. Reading the room, inviting strategic defiance. DQSH is organized differently than the usual classroom experience. The art of drag is defiant, playful, unruly. Drag is largely improvisational and relies on a performer's practiced adaptation to an audience. There is an art to knowing when to wing it, to take a break from being a control queen, or to make room for a bit of chaos. Words or dance steps get forgotten, a song skips, a prop breaks, and audiences often talk back. Drag queens have little interest in such mechanical and dull ideas as classroom management. Classroom management as a framework relies on rules and procedures as a sort of factory model for quality control. It stifles creativity and aims towards order, marching towards a mirage of identical outcomes and efficient productivity. This reinforces what Foucault called the carceral continuum, which disproportionately funnels minoritized students towards prisons and other forms of confinement. As an art form, drag is all about bending and breaking the rules, and so its aims are totally different from a normative classroom. When a drag queen enters a classroom, she generally intends to draw attention to herself, whether through shock, admiration, or envy of her embodied performance. There's a premium on standing out, on artfully desecrating the sacred. In other words, what we refer to as strategic defiance is encouraged. What might strategic defiance look like in a classroom setting? How might teachers encourage children to talk back rather than suppressing dissent? Arts education scholar Elliot Eisner wrote, "In the arts, judgments are made in the absence of rule." How can educators teach children how to skillfully question authority or break the rules? Drag may offer insights into how educators might support a practice of strategic defiance. In the moments when a child interrupts, a queen might respond to them as she would a heckler at a show. Rather than punishing a child by reprimanding or removing them, a queen is more likely to try to engage the child's energy and use it to fuel her performance. As drag artist Taylor Mack insists, when an audience member is threatening to take the story away from the storyteller, then you have to incorporate them into the story at all costs. That's why the best queens engage their hecklers, turning the butt of the joke around, or better yet, forming a sense of solidarity between the performer and heckler against the outside world. Young students, like hecklers, interrupt or act out because they're genuinely curious or excited, don't fully understand something, or feel excluded or looking for a way to participate. By playfully responding to and incorporating children's feedback rather than dismissing it, teachers might invite the students into co-constructing the classroom environment. In a broader context, fostering collective unruliness also helps children to understand that they can have a hand in changing their environment. For any child who has ever asked a parent or teacher why and been unsatisfied with the answer, "because I told you so," drag may help elucidate the arbitrariness of rules. By encouraging students to explore the boundaries of acceptability, drag offers a model for participating in a learning experience where axioms are meant to be challenged and authority is not a given. In the school environment, of course, oppressive conditions are often produced by the institution itself, and many children who intuitively resist these conditions are punished. DQSH performers demonstrate a refusal to be told what to do. In their demonstration of strategic defiance, drag storytellers engage in a more finely tuned kind of resistance that many children practice all the time. This embodied pedagogy teaches that in unjust situations, people can use strategic tactics to push back against harmful actions. Drag may be especially well positioned as a form of cultural production that, to paraphrase the writer and filmmaker Tony Cade Bambara, serves to make revolution irresistible. Similarly, drag aesthetics can provide an avenue into exploring children's curiosities about social norms, which often reflect inconsistencies in what they have been taught. At many DQSH events, children ask genuine questions like, "Are you a boy or a girl?" or "Why are you dressed like that?" often embarrassing their well-meaning parents or teachers. Although some questions can be hurtful in many non-drag contexts, DQSH creates a space in which performers can answer personally and honestly. In many cases, drag queens may not respond with answers, but with questions meant to complicate perceptions of gender in society. why does it matter if I'm a boy or a girl? Or why shouldn't I wear sequins and feathers and lots of makeup? Drag loves to turn rejection into desire, transforming the labor of performance into the pleasure of participation. Typically, as an audience member, you don't pay attention because you have to, you pay attention because you want to. Here, DQSH reaches towards what educational philosopher Michelinos Zembilas referred to as a pedagogy of desire. Drawing from Deleuze and Guardia, Zembilas theorized such a pedagogy as one that draws attention to the social and political construction of desire and transforms the valorization of essential basic knowledge and skills into a site of political analysis. In so doing, pedagogies of desire strive to create landscapes of becoming, engaging with the risks and pleasures of modifying and being modified by the world. The aesthetics of drag offer a landscape for becoming through a vision of self-determination and freedom within a collective. You can do what you want to do. You can be who you want to be in a practice that takes place in constant conversation with others. It is a theater cult that is trying to fracture children's concrete sense of reality and convince them into a collectivist revolution. These are their own words, in their own paper, from their own website resources, dragstoryour.org. Camping it up, embracing shame as curriculum. DQSH embraces a kind of camp curriculum. Here, we think of curriculum as an active process that seeks to reopen potentialities outside of what children have come to expect about society. Camp, like drag, cannot be defined or explicitly taught. In Susan Sontag's formative essay, she refers to camp as a sensibility that relies on unapologetic artifice, in the treatment of life as theater by dethroning the serious through the proper mixture of the exaggerated, the fantastic, the passionate, and the naive. Camp is not simply a gimmick, as Christopher Isherwood makes explicit. You can't camp about something you don't take seriously. You're not making fun of it, you're making fun out of it. You're expressing what's basically serious to you in terms of fun and artifice and elegance. Camp thus allows a performer to survive oppressive conditions and address otherwise painful subjects by decontextualizing and defanging them. As a performative practice, camp, and by extension drag, seeks to embrace failure and shame, ideas whose substance may look different for children, but still provoke highly effective reactions. In the context of DQSH, campily addressing these topics may involve reading books like Taro Gomi's Everyone Poops that may feel a bit scandalous or taboo to children or the adults accompanying them, fostering a spirit of irreverence and impropriety in the classroom. Choosing to read a story like Everyone Poops makes fun out of a book that would make many teachers nervous. It's true, everybody does poop, and the people who perhaps most regularly remind society of that are young children. In preschool, when many children are recently potty trained, a source of pride is quickly made into something shameful at school. Poop is private and not to be discussed here. DQSH dethrones the serious by taking toilet humor out of the bathroom and into public space, aligning with a common childhood experience by laughing with them at a stigmatized topic, thereby challenging the implicit rules of school. Similarly, many campy drag aesthetics like parody and exaggeration destigmatize shame by placing the joke on society rather than the individuals, further revealing to kids that ideas of appropriateness are subject to change. For example, Little Miss Hot Mess's picture book, The Hips on the Drag Queen Go Swish, 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 encourages kids to move their hips in ways often coded as effeminate. This not only breaks the taboo of acting effeminate or identifying with queer figures, but also opens space for children to study drag as a source of creative inspiration. Classroom teachers might similarly work to address children's feelings of shame by highlighting the arbitrariness of norms, treating the disconnect between individual experience and institutional expectations as an important site of knowledge production to guide change. Further, drag and camp both embody culturally specific forms of critical pedagogy. Apart from reflecting a superficial style over substance, camp requires deep engagement with its material. As Philip Core noted, camp is the lie that tells the truth. That is, drag helps us better understand dominant culture by transforming its constitutive elements. In this way, camp echoes feminist standpoint theory, foregrounding interpretation from one's own cultural situation as well as broader social context. Thus, while drag incorporates elements of fantasy, it is meant to reveal rather than deceive. Contrary to the prevalence of misinformation today, drag offers a playful call to consider information from many angles, question its motivations, and cite its sources with the wink of an eye. In a camp-informed curriculum, students might develop media literacies not only through studying established canons, but also by parodying pop songs or rewriting their favorite books in order to imagine beyond the worlds they inhabit. So, coaxing children into taking nothing seriously. Do you get it? Yep. Taboos are just subject to change in their own words that they provide on their own website, dragstoryhour.org. From empathy to embodied kinship. Finally, it is often assumed that the primary pedagogical goal of queer education should be to increase empathy towards LGBT people. While this premise has some merit and underlies many sincere projects in educational and cultural work, including DQSH, the notion of empathy has also been critiqued by feminist scholars of color and others by the ways in which empathy can enable an affective appropriation of an individual's unique experiences and reinforce hierarchies of power. Scholars have invoked terms like false empathy, identity tourism, and empathy's obliteration of the other to critique the claims of putting yourself in someone else's shoes via various empathy machines. Whether through literature or virtual reality, these tropes tend to reflect an overstated ability to understand difference, as well as empathy's potential to preclude meaningful relationships of solidarity. It is undeniable that DQSH participates in many of these tropes of empathy, from the marketing language the program uses to its selection of books. Much of this is strategically done in order to justify its educational value. However, we suggest that drag supports scholars' critiques of empathy, rather than reifying the concept. Drag performers do not necessarily seek identification with an other, but rather to experience ways of embodying and expressing different aspects of themselves. Rather than walking in someone else's shoes and trying to understand what it might mean to be a different gender, for example, drag offers a model for participants to try on many costumes and cosmetics to understand how these elements reinforce or alter their own sense of self. In the classroom, this queer dress-up might create many opportunities for young people to experiment with the feeling of how and why seemingly arbitrary changes of clothing and behavior impact the ways they experience and are interpreted by the world. That is, drag is an imaginative and creative process. It is grounded in building character, both in the sense of constructing a persona and in better understanding one's own relations to others. This approach can support students in finding the unique or queer aspects of themselves, rather than attempting to understand what it's like to be LGBT. Drag pedagogy brings a sense of queerness more robustly into the classroom, not merely teaching about Harvey Milk or Sylvia Rivera, but through an embodied and effective process. Cultural theorists have long described relationships of solidarity across difference, from Audre Lorde's foundational calls to learn from each other's differences in our common battles for a livable future, to Harney and Moten's more recent theorization of study as about simply what you do with other people, that honors the incessant and the irreversible intellectuality of these activities is already present. Rather than building empathy from a set of presumed straight or cisgender children, then drag pedagogy might enact a mode of queer kinship that acknowledges that there is already queerness within the classroom. In turn, drag queen teachers have much to learn from interactions with children. Many queens reflect that DQSH allows them to build relationships with young people that otherwise would not be possible. Some queens who faced homo and transphobic mistreatment as children have said that DQSH has offered a kind of healing and hope. queer theory has generally reflected pessimism about the future, and some queer theorists have rejected the compulsory reproductivity that children often represent in society. However, following Munoz, we suggest that DQSH offers a queer relationality with children that breaks from the reproductive futurity of the normative classroom and nuclear family. Munoz wrote, "Queerness should and could be about a desire for another way of being in both the world and time, a desire that resists mandates to accept that which is not enough." Similarly, Sarah Ahmed writes about queer use as ways of remaking existing pathways and institutions, often by those who are not conceived as the intended users. In writing about how everyday experiences can serve as queer teachers, she notes that such work requires more than an act of affirmation, it requires world-dismantling effort. We offer that the kinship created by Drag Pedagogy might offer a way of thinking beyond both the cruel optimism and potential utopias of the horizon, to consider how alternate worlds are being made in the here and now. They're talking about pederasty. What you think is normal and healthy to them is just the nation-state trying to oppress you into creating itself. They're trying to build their own world into one that includes and perpetuates pederasty. That's why they only refer to boys and shamefulness of femininity. This is the provided resource on their own website, dragstoryour.org. And finally, the conclusion. As drag has moved further into the mainstream, some have questioned whether this queer art form has lost its edge. In discussing the work of DQSH within our social circles, we have occasionally encountered critiques that DQSH is sanitizing the risque nature of drag in order to make it family-friendly. We do not share this pessimistic view. Queer world-making, including political organizing, has long been a project driven by desire. It is, in part, enacted through art forms like fashion, theater, and drag. We believe that DQSH offers an initiation towards deeper political engagement with queer cultural production, particularly for young children and their families. It may be that DQSH is family-friendly in the sense that it is accessible and inviting to families with children. But it is less a sanitizing force than it is a preparatory introduction to alternate modes of kinship. Here, DQSH is family-friendly in the sense of family as an old-school queer code to identify and connect with other queers on the street. We do, however, share the well-founded concerns surrounding the profit-driven co-optation of queer social movements. We certainly understand why the mainstream public would be drawn to queer artistry. Quite frankly, why wouldn't you be? It looks good, it's edgy, and it's a lot of fun. However, when public engagement with queer culture is shallow, it risks becoming exploitative. In this way, DQSH is caught in the crosshairs of capitalism. Drag queens are simultaneously among the most beloved and reviled members of queer communities, and their feminized labor has historically been exploited in service of entertainment. Of course, drag queens are also workers who need to make money now, and DQSH provides a new avenue for income. As DQSH gains a wider public audience, there are the usual requests for resources that can be used to advance LGBT inclusion in schools. These requests beckon the production of boxed curricula, corporate-style inclusivity trainings, and lesson sequences that can be absorbed by school structures and budgets. Prefabricated replicable curricula may offer profitability, but performance art is not easily packaged. We ask, will DQSH succumb to pragmatism, or will it revel in its strategic defiance, its transformative power, its campy thrills, and its alternate kinship structures? As we write this article, DQSH continues to draw public enthusiasm and is set to expand. Of course we're excited about that, yet we also wonder how DQSH can continue to exist, in Munoz's words, on the horizon, engaging with the power of young children's imaginations today to begin to envision alternate tomorrows. Playing with drag can be a way to remember that. In the words of Harney and Moten, we are already here, moving. We are dressing up, we're shaking our hips, and we're finding our light. even in the fluorescence. We're reading books while we read each other's looks, and we're leaving a trail of glitter that won't ever come out of the carpet. Do you get it now? I've gone through the whole thing. This isn't pro-LGBT. This is anti-LGBT. This is using and actively detrimental to LGBT. They are a tool to this. They're leaving a trail of glitter that won't ever come out of the carpet. That carpet is your child. This is their own paper that they give in their own website for you to read on dragstoryhour.org.